Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar addressing homelessness, crisis intervention strategies for people with serious mental illness and co-occurring disorders. This is the fourth event in the Effective Outreach Engagement Services series. My name is Zach Stewart, and I'm going to be your producer for today's event. And before we get going, I'm just going to run through a couple quick housekeeping slides. This event is being recorded. I just want to let you know that, and audio is now broadcasting, so everyone should be hearing my voice. We are providing audio via the computer speakers today. We strongly recommend that you use the computer speakers if possible, and if not possible, we can connect you via your phone. You just let us know in that all questions box underneath the slides if you're having any audio problems, and we can assist you there. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services or the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We are providing live captioning for this event. Just click that link on your screen that you see right now to access those live captions. And we've also put that in the all questions box that I mentioned right underneath the slides, and you can access that at any time during today's event. Those captions are going to open in a new window or tab on your screen that you can position anywhere you like, and you can adjust the size, color, and speed of the captions. Your line is going to be muted for today's presentation, but you can communicate with us in that public chat box, which I see many of you have found already. That's going to be located to the right of the slides, right underneath my picture there and our speakers' pictures as they go throughout the presentation today. Just be aware that anything you type in there is visible to everybody in the room. And we do have that all questions box. You can communicate with us in that as well. Please do type all of your content questions and your tech questions in that box. We will respond to the tech questions right in there, and we will save the content questions for the Q&A at the end of today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to our moderator for today, Sherry Downing, SAMHSA's HHRN Deputy Director. Sherry, are you with us?
I am. Thank you, Zach, and welcome, everyone. I am delighted that you're here to join us. This is going to be a fabulous presentation. I'm very excited about it. Let me tell you a tiny bit about what we're going to be discussing today. It's reflected in our agenda. So we're going to talk about some of the statistics on serious mental illness, homelessness, substance use disorders, and incarceration, and then look at SMI in particular with regard to chronic conditions. We'll share some case examples, and then we will also share some crisis intervention strategies. And then, as always, there'll be time at the end for some questions and answers before we close. So please don't hesitate to put your questions up in the questions box. We will triage those. We will not address any questions until the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to put them up at any point. With that, I would like to introduce Doreen Gross, who is the PATH Program Coordinator for SAMHSA's Division of State and Community Systems Development. Ms. Gross has more than 20 years of experience working on grants and contracts portfolio associated with individuals who are at risk for or experiencing homelessness. And those programs include PATH and treatment for individuals experiencing homelessness, cooperative agreements to benefit homeless individuals, and services in supportive housing, grant programs. Ms. Gross has worked with numerous federal partners to coordinate services, policies, and housing and homelessness-related activities, and formerly served as the contracting officer representative core on the Homeless and Housing Resource Network, which is putting on this webinar today. Ms. Gross holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland, and she is a fabulous advocate for the PATH program. So Doreen, if you'd like to say a few words, come on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sherry. And greetings, everyone. On behalf of SAMHSA, welcome to the Crisis Intervention Strategies for People with Serious Mental Illness and Co-occurring Disorders webinar. We are really excited about this webinar today. I think you're going to get a lot of good information So for today's webinar, you're going to hear about some of the clinical aspects of serious mental illness as it relates to crisis among people with experiencing homelessness. Recent data shows that serious mental illness affects 1 in 20 Americans, but it affects 1 in 5 people experiencing homelessness and 1 in 4 people in jail and 1 in 6 with a substance use disorder. So anyway, our presenters will share quite a bit of information. They're going to talk about some of the strategies for assisting people with crisis, some of the symptoms you may encounter when working with people who have SMI, and understanding these symptoms to help identify and respond to crisis. And you're also going to hear about the physical health conditions that may rise to crisis levels among people with serious mental illness experiencing homelessness. I will turn it back over to Sherry, and she's going to introduce the presenters for today. Sherry?
Thanks, Doreen. I appreciate that. So we've got a couple learning objectives that I'll share with you first, and then I'll introduce you to our presenters and they can get started. So we're hoping that after participating in today's webinar, you'll be able to better understand the intersection of SMI, SUDs, and other conditions, as well as homelessness and incarceration, be able to identify some of the SMI diagnoses, and identify the impact of SMI, COD, and SUD on populations and communities, and finally become familiar with some strategies of engagement to assist in facilitating hope and healing. We've got just the right people here today to talk to you about all that. We have Brian R. Sims, MD, who is a Senior Medical Advisor for the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. He's also a Senior Consultant for the NASHBID Center for Innovation in Behavioral Health Policy and Practice, where he provides lectures and trainings nationally and internationally on the practice of trauma-informed care and developing strategies for systems to become trauma responsive, as well as teaching on the neurobiological and biopsychosocial impact of trauma. Such interesting topics. He provides numerous lectures and webinars on SMI and SUD-related topics with strategies for change to improve patient outcomes. Most recently, he was a lead consultant for trauma-informed care in faith-based communities. Dr. Sims served with Maryland's mental health system for 25 years and maintained a private practice for 10 years before retiring. He is also a veteran who served in the U.S. Army Reserves at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where he worked with soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that doesn't specifically say you were a veteran, Dr. Sims, so you can correct that when you come on. And then we also have Tiffany Juarez, MSW, LCSW, who's a clinician with the Homeless Division of the San Antonio Department of Human Services. Tiffany leverages her experience and community connections for continuous quality improvement to homeless services in the city. In the past year, she developed collaborations between city law enforcement, county sheriffs, and the Bexar County court system, including a protocol for homeless referrals for San Antonio police. She also provides mobile therapy for people experiencing homelessness, and she spearheaded the development of evidence-based programming for the Homeless Division. Before joining DHS, Ms. Juarez served as the Director of Admissions at San Antonio State Hospital, where she was responsible for all civil and forensic admissions. And she was also previously a crisis team social worker with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas and a social worker with Choices Counseling Center in Indiana. She obtained her BSW from Grace College and Theological Seminary in Indiana and her MSW from Our Lady of the Lake University in Texas. So both of them have a lot to share with you. I'm super excited. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Brian. Welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
All righty. Well, thank you first and foremost to everyone who's attending, and a special thanks out to SAMHSA and this wonderful organization for allowing me this opportunity to be able to talk just a little bit about this incredibly important topic. As has been mentioned, I do a lot of work in trauma-informed care, and what I wanted to do is, over this overview, try to not do certain things. I'm not going to be training individuals or educating, because many of you already know about many of the aspects I'll be talking about. If you carry anything from what we're going to be talking about in this brief period, I want you to understand that it is engagement, collaboration, and connection that is going to be the highlight of this particular talk. So for the next few moments, I wanted to go through just a couple of slides with you to kind of bring us up to date. As we look at where we are today in our society, persons experiencing homelessness, you all know, has been on the uprise. And because of that, we are talking about a population that is mixed in terms of their presentations to any of our services across the country. This first slide shows you an annual homeless assessment report that was done that just took a point shot estimate looking across the country on a one-night element, and over 500,000 individuals were persons who were experiencing homelessness. Of that group, you see the figures that roughly 82% were adults, roughly 18% were children. But then when you look at the last two figures, you begin to see why we're having this discussion. Because of that 500,000 persons experiencing homelessness, you were talking about a great majority, nearly half of that group, having either severe mental illness or chronic substance use, and I would imagine that it would also include the co-occurring aspect, which is built into those figures. So it helps us to be able to understand why this topic is so important, because many of the people that you see in your clinics, in your inpatient, outpatient settings, this becomes something of how do we connect with these individuals so that we can provide them with the best care that they can get, and also to be able to find ways to do connections so we can talk even about preventive strategies. But let's take a look at another piece of the data that we sometimes skip over just a tad. We need to take a look also at our incarcerated population, because within that population you have an admixture. You have individuals also who are not part of the outside statistics that you just saw, but are also adding to those statistics. This particular slide here shows you on the left homelessness amongst the jail population, and this is at a particular point in time that this assessment is being done, but the figures kind of show that of all of those individuals that are incarcerated, there is roughly 15% of them that have some degree of mental illness involved in their stay there. Roughly 3%, as you see here, were homeless at the time of their incarceration, and others, the 12%, at least within the past year, have been homeless. Why this is important data is also these individuals quite often are going to be the ones that are released out of this facility to go back to the community to add into those numbers. So when we are seeing individuals on a day-to-day basis, understanding where they are coming from can have a lot of effect in terms of how they present to us in our services. So let's just move to what is serious mental illness. Serious mental illness, as you see here, is a mental behavioral emotional disorder. And in this case, we're not putting in substance use or developmental disorders as part of that constellation. So we're really looking at individuals that have problems in terms of their ability to have social interactions and occupational functioning. We're all familiar with the GAF, or Global Assessment Functioning, but the data that Doreen had mentioned a little earlier is really something that alerts us that the services we provide are not only important, but critical in terms of making a difference to this particular population, as 1 in 20 out of that population has a serious mental illness, whereas 1 in 5 for any mental illness. So it raises that concept that many of you have heard that talks about universal precautions. And in the Universal Precaution Network, it says that every individual that you receive into your services, you should make the assumption that these things may exist in terms of your connection. Now, that's important because many of them are going to present with different symptomatology that's going to be somewhat difficult to filter through and somewhat difficult to engage. And this is one of the reasons why it's important in this process, not just to understand the diagnostic classification, but to understand the uniqueness of that individual as they make their presentations. We look at the next slide, and it shows individuals with substance use disorder that totals roughly the 20 million that we had talked about a little earlier. But what we want you to see is that of that grouping, almost half of those individuals have some degree of mental illness history versus serious mental illness history. Roughly 48% are in that particular element. So it really tells us about the high prevalence of co-occurring disorders within those diagnostic realms. So persons experiencing homelessness, for instance, are individuals that quite often you will see will have a combination of these elements in their presentation. Hence, it makes it even more important, as we'll talk about later, and I'm sure Tiffany will talk about as well. It's really taking a look at the person as a person and not so much as a diagnostic realm. Now let's take a look at serious mental illness as what it entails. Serious mental illness, as you see from the slide here, really entails a constellation of different diagnostic classifications, all of which you've seen through the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5, that gives you a pretty in-depth understanding of what it takes. Now, I'm going to review them very quickly, but I'm not focusing so much on the diagnostic connection because many of us are very good at doing that. But I just want you to see from the diagnostic descriptions how complicated that individual may be that presents themselves to you. Now, I've been working in the mental health field for over 40 years, and I know from years ago, it used to be that we would actually change the way we responded to people based on their diagnostic realm. If we saw someone who was schizophrenic, and that particular person who was schizophrenic had a illness that really kind of told us that there was very little we could do for them, how much that has changed over the years. Now let's just take a look at the first group, the major depressive disorder. As the DSM-5 indicates, we're really looking at symptoms that are persistent. These are symptoms that have been around for at least a period of 2 weeks, because it helps to understand that we all have emotional responses to different things that are occurring in our lives, but it's the length of time that we have these persistent symptoms that give the diagnostic specificity that we're looking for that calls it major depressive disorder. If we look at something like schizophrenia, again, we're talking about time frame, persistence of symptomatology, but in addition, a constellation of symptoms that by the DSM-5 has to include at least a couple of these particular symptomatologies of delusions or hallucinations or disorganized behavior, the things that you see here on the slide. We move then to bipolar disorder. And in bipolar disorder, many of us are familiar. Our patients do present to us in that fashion, sometimes in a manic episode, sometimes in a mixed state, but some of them may have major depressive symptomatology. Some others may have, in accordance with that, may have some psychotic elements. But then we tease further to look at the specifiers and take it down to rapid cycling versus melancholy features versus mood incongruent or congruent features and the seasonal patterns. So it makes this individual much more complex who is presenting to you than just a person who is coming to you saying, I'm homeless and I have a substance use issue. Let's move then to taking a look at obsessive compulsive disorders. In the obsessive compulsive disorder category, as many of you already know, it's presence of one or both of the obsessions versus compulsions. And I say versus because in the obsessions, these are individuals that have these recurrent episodes and very persistent, intrusive anxiety and distress. And the way that they deal with it is they attempt to ignore it in a way to suppress the symptomatology. When we talk about those with compulsions, these are acts that are driven that is actually in a response to their obsession. And they feel they have to do these events in order to reduce their anxiety or distress. So you can see the difference there when we're doing our assessment, that it really takes into account the lifestyle of the individual, the behavior patterns of that individual, it's helpful in that regard to look at that piece. It's very, as you can see, very time-consuming for the person. They come in and they're literally exhausted by what this repetitive pattern has done to their particular scenario and how they present themselves to us. We then look at panic disorder, where you see recurrent unexpected panic attacks. This is something where we as clinicians quite often are overwhelmed by the response pattern because it's so abrupt and it's so intense. And it can go from 0 to 100, as we would say in the realm of trauma, in a very, very, very quick stage. And that can sometimes overtake our ability to connect and our ability to really assist that individual at that time. But it's well to be understood that that presentation is something that we can assist with. In it, the symptoms are very familiar. I'm sure many of you have seen these symptoms before with the palpitations, complaints of chills or heat sensations, the derealization, the sometimes pain, chest pain or discomfort, the fear of dying. All of these components are well known in terms of what panic disorder is about. Now, even if we pause here to just take a look at what we are experiencing, if any of the homeless individuals that we are seeing, or persons experiencing homeless, will come into our settings, we can see that it is much more complicated than determining whether or not they have a specific diagnostic realm. I want to move to post-traumatic stress disorder next. And this is one that is near and dear to me only because of what was mentioned earlier with my working with soldiers. And I wanted to start with that by taking that stigma away from it. And I'm not calling it a negative stigma per se, but what I'm saying is that when post-traumatic stress became a prevalent thing in our minds and our eyes, we began to see that it was predominantly linked to soldiers. And what we realized over time is that anyone can experience post-traumatic stress. When we were doing work with trauma, many of the children in the communities still fit these same patterns that we don't identify or didn't identify back then as post-traumatic stress, but clearly were post-traumatic responses. So the exposure to the stressors may be direct, may be indirect, or may be repeated. Now, we take a look at that. When I was working with the soldiers at Walter Reed, there was a study that was done then at the time to talk to the soldiers about it, and what we found was that 80% of soldiers with the diagnosis of PTSD said that their trauma came from what they witnessed as opposed to what directly happened to them. So it raises the element that if this is happening within their population, how many folks in the communities have had experienced historical or community traumas that have led to either direct or indirect traumas in their lives and are presenting with the same symptomatology that we kind of overshadow or miss. And that would include nightmares, flashbacks, prolonged distress. Just on a kind of sidebar note, I don't know if any of you have been watching New Amsterdam, the show that comes on each week. But it was an interesting show that talked about children in school, and one child who was exposed to a drill that the school had as far as simulating an active shooter, but the kids were not told and the teachers were not told. And the child observed a friend of hers being shot in the hallway, supposedly, and it traumatized her tremendously, only to find out that it was a simulated event, but it didn't take the trauma away. So it's one of those things where, again, we need to take a look at all populations. And in the statistics I gave you a little earlier, remember that of that population of homeless, we're still talking a significant percentage of children that are involved in that. Let's look also at the fact that there's alterations in arousal and reactivity, that there are functional and occupational impairments that go with this, and that the symptoms by DSM standards usually persist longer than 30 days. But the last part is the most significant piece, significant disruption in their normal life pursuits. For many of them, once establishment of connection and collaboration, and as well getting that person to trust, they share with you that many times the reason why they're experiencing homelessness has a lot to do with this disruption based on even having the traumatic experiences in their lives. Now we'll move to one that a lot of clinicians will really talk quite a bit about, and that's borderline personality disorder. This is one that most clinicians will say is a very difficult population to work with because of the intensity of their presentations. There's a frantic effort to avoid real or even imagined abandonment. But you want to look at a couple of things that are very tough for the therapist as well as for the individual experiencing it. The identity disturbance, where they have unstable self-images, but also the impulsivity is the most difficult part that a lot of times we as clinicians have to work with, because these particular individuals may engage in tremendously risky behaviors. Having sex in mixed populations, substance use, the reckless driving, the binge eating, all of those things make for a very difficult person, but also recurrent suicidal behaviors and gestures and threats or self-mutilating behavior. And this leads to, again, what happens with the individual's presentation, that quite often when the suicidal threats become repeated over and over again, it tends to diminish their credibility in some of the views of the people making assessments. So again, we go back to, do we understand the story? And I'll add another piece to it, to please assess the individual to say the following, that all behavior has meaning. Because in that, it helps us to be able to connect a little better. There are chronic feelings in this case of emptiness, and this anger and difficulty controlling the anger, which can be self-directed or can be directed towards the person working with them. So these are all powerful components that says that we have a complex group of individuals in the persons that are experiencing homelessness, or the co-occurring population that we are contending with. But I'd be remiss somewhat if I didn't put the medical piece in, because one of the things that we fail to realize, and a lot of times, and in these few slides hopefully will show, is that quite often we miss a diagnosis by being too connected to the mental health component. We have, for instance, the diagnosis of a person who may have major depression or may have schizophrenia, and we focus on that particular diagnostic realm. And by doing so, we end up missing the fact that there are significant medical issues that pose a tremendous risk. So that is something that I just wanted you to see here, because sometimes it's missed by the person not relating the information to us, but quite often it's missed by ourselves by not looking at it, because of the stigma, because of the person that is in front of us, because of our viewpoints of that individual. It can come from the fact that we don't have a lot of time to work with the person. But often it can come from the patients themselves, because they're not compliant with treatment, they are not involved in a continuity of care and so forth, or there are factors even in the community that take away from that. I recall in Baltimore, the wonderful program that is there that was called the HOT team, and the HOT stood for Homeless Outreach Team. This was a group of Baltimore City police officers who spent their time in the evening time going into the homeless community and engaging these people in services. And what they discovered is that quite often their engagement led to trust and people being able to work with them, but they couldn't get them into certain services without parameters that were 24, 48, 72 hours down the road, and they couldn't find the person to be able to supply it. So we recognize that there. I also want to point out the antecedents that are there, things that we have very little or no control over. We can't control our genetics or fetal development. We have limited control on inflammatory processes or neuroendocrine processes, as well as little control over our diets. And some people have very little control with regards to their social status in terms of poverty or deprivation. But I do want you to see how any of these factors are intimately not just related to mental illness, but also to medical illnesses. And what we see is a fervent need to ensure that everyone that we work with gets a full workup with regards to questioning about medical background, so that we do not miss out on that particular component. Now, this slide actually is linked with the post-traumatic stress disorder, but it really is a risk factor that is somewhat related when you take a look at the fact that many of the symptomatologies that come up in post-traumatic stress are sometimes misconstrued as medical issues, but also can be directly related with medical issues. So it's a good place for it that makes this person vulnerable, because all these factors, like in anything else, can diminish immune response and have that individual actually be more open for medical disorders to be in their component. I just want to say something very quickly about hepatitis C as well. This is a message to kind of say that, and I'll go to the next slide because it'll show it a little bit better, but we had a high prevalence of hepatitis C in the general population. And over time, what we found was that because of interventions that we were able to put in place, like the widespread introduction of the hepatitis C antibody testing, people began to become more safe feeling. They began to feel that this wasn't a huge thing. But I do want you to see the data at the top right corner that really talks about the fact that during this time, those who use drugs, there was a 30 to 70% prevalence, increasing. Incarcerated population, increasing. Persons experiencing homelessness, increasing. So these are things, again, that raise our awareness. And I am trying to really, at this juncture, just say to everyone, open your perspectives of assessment, that you are looking at an individual that has the potential to have a lot of additional data that you are going to be able to connect with. Now, the general goals of treatment are simple. There are things that I'm sure you're already doing, but again, to reiterate what we talked about before, it's engagement, it's connection, it's collaboration. The purpose of that is to reduce the core symptoms. But also, in a preventive fashion, work with this individual with regards to hope, to help them to improve the function and quality of life, to also remind them and help bolster their resilience. So again, as we talked about with the medical associations, look for comorbid disorders and help to relieve them, because many times when medical disorders are made better, the individual tends to get better. I have a very quick example of an individual who's a 45-year-old attorney who presented to my service grossly psychotic. He had no mental health past history, and what we could get from him simply indicated a very psychotic individual. But a long story, after we were able to get more history from that person, we found out that he was an alcoholic, that he drank very heavily, that he had significant liver issues, which were not assessed initially. Once we determined that that was there, we found out his ammonia levels were incredibly high, and this was the reason for the disordered thinking. And after giving him medication to remove the ammonia from the bloodstream through the bowels, his mental status improved tremendously. So it helped us to be able to understand that not everyone presents in that fashion. And what I want to do as we close out is just leave you with one of the two examples that I have listed here. I want to talk about Nicholas, only because Nicholas was interesting, and his name is not Nicholas, obviously. It's been changed. But we did a lot of work in Baltimore City, and we were working at what was called the Baltimore War Memorial Building, which was a building that was open for memorabilia from the military. And we just happened to have our session there. And this young man comes walking into the door of this building and walks right into our session that had over 150 people in it. And there were about maybe 50 or so Baltimore City police officers also in attendance in the session. And he simply walked up the middle aisle and he sat in the session and he proceeded to put his head down. Later, he opened the door and he saw a drawer or a little bag, and he began to rumble through the bag. Well, immediately all eyes fell on him, and they began to complain that he's stealing things and that they need to take him out. Long story short, when we spoke to him, he was a homeless veteran from North Carolina who had been long since diagnosed with schizophrenia with multiple delusions, had been on medication, and had been sent back without medication, wandered into Maryland, came into the building because he thought it would help him with his military components. The interesting part was the stigma with regards to the affiliation. But I want to give kudos in this particular case example because it was the Baltimore City police officers who engaged with him and actually offered their services, and through their engagement, he shared all of that information that I just gave to you. So what does it say to us is that people are still looking for that connection, regardless of diagnosis or perception. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for the time that I've been given. I do appreciate this tremendously, and I would hope that in some small way it helps to you with working with a population that is extremely difficult to work with. So thank you again, folks, and at this point, I would like to turn it over to Tiffany.
Thank you, Brian. I will be discussing crisis intervention strategies today. I will provide you with examples based on my experience as a licensed clinical social worker in the city of San Antonio. I currently work for City of San Antonio Department of Human Services Homeless Division, and I am housed with the SAPD North Safe officers. My particular program is a pilot in San Antonio, and I receive my referrals from the SAPD North Safe officers and also from constituents in the community and City Council. Today I'm going to talk about safety and then strategies. I think the first thing that I'm going to talk about are safety measures to be reflected. I think safety is really important to talk about when we're talking about crisis intervention strategies, because if we're not thinking about our safety and the safety of our clients, then we may end up in a situation where we get hurt or others get hurt. So one of the things that we always look at when we're going out in crisis situations or just going out to do outreach is our environment and where we are and what is around us. And so we are always aware of hazards. We also take universal precautions as we go out. If we are aware that there are places where we may need gloves or other precautions, we ensure that we have those things. One thing that I've learned in working with SAPD is situational awareness, to know where I am at all times so that I can call for help if it's needed. I always am with officers, but if we were ever in a situation where I needed to call for help, I would need to know where we were, what's the street name, how far, if we're in the woods, how far in the woods are we, and how to get to us. So I think this is really important, and we're looking at crisis situations where oftentimes we may not know that there's going to be a crisis, and we need to be aware. So it's always good when you're going out to do outreach to be aware of where you are so you can call for assistance. I also added on the slide partnership with law enforcement. Everything that I do, I work with our SAPD North Safe. I work with our SAPD Hope team. We also have a mental health team that I work with as well, and I work with the Bexar County Sheriff's mental health team. And they are very helpful in working with individuals with severe mental illness and also individuals with substance abuse disorders. In San Antonio, our law enforcement has 3 different teams that work with individuals with severe mental illness and substance abuse, and they know the individuals in our community very well. And so they're able to help me know history about the individuals and also know if they have family around or if they previously were connected with services, and sometimes what happened when they were connected with those services. So I'm very lucky to be part of that team. And I think that if you're able to partner with your law enforcement where you are, kind of learning about the situational awareness and environmental precautions that you can take it's very helpful to work with them because they are trained in those strategies. And then one thing that I learned from a sergeant that I worked with is that you never sacrifice safety for rapport, and I think that is very important, and we'll continue to repeat that throughout the session. So assess and approach. Anytime that there is a crisis, it is important to assess what's happening and attempt to determine baseline of the individual, and also attempt to understand the strengths of the individual. I'm going to give a few examples of various crises that I have been able to work with and try to go through these different approaches. So individual one, her name for the presentation is Katie. She's a 52-year-old female. She was identified by SAPD to be sleeping in her vehicle with 6 cats. And we went out to speak to her, and one of the things that continued to come up with her, she was discussing that she had major depressive disorder. She was also an alcoholic, and she really, really wanted to get help. And she said she didn't want to be on the street any longer. She didn't want to end up being chronically homeless, and she wanted to stop drinking. She had recently lost her job, and she was losing resources as her family had tried to help her, but they were getting frustrated with her situation. So I continued to talk to her, and one of the factors that was really important to her if she was to get into a program was her cats that were living in her car with her. So she was worried about losing her cats, not being able to take them, as she said that they were very therapeutic to her. So we discussed that situation, and I was very honest because I think it's very important when people are in crisis that you listen to what their needs are, but then also let them know the truth of what's available. So I let her know that I would be able to help her keep at least one of her cats, and that in order for me to be able to get her into a program, there was not one that would allow her to have 6 cats, but I assured her that the 5 other kittens that she had, that I would find an appropriate home or setting for them. So we talked about that, and she was able to come to an agreement that she was okay with us finding new homes for those 5 cats. So we started the process of working with her to get her into a program. And during the process, one of the questions that came up during her assessment to get into the program was, do you have pets? And she stated that she had 6 cats. She started to become very anxious at this point, and the individual doing the assessment said, well, we can't have those cats here. And so she became very anxious, and she said that she didn't know if she could do the program then. And so then I was able to talk to her about what we had discussed, and then the facility had stated that they were able to keep one of the cats after a certain time frame, and I let her know that there was a place that would be able to foster her cat until she was able to have her cat there. So I was able to take 20 to 30 minutes to listen to her feelings about, losing her 5 cats, but also discussing what her goals were. And her main goal was to not end up chronically homeless. And so she was willing to go into the program, and then I worked with the SAPD North Safe officers in finding homes for the 5 kittens, and we were able to put the other cat into a foster situation until she was until she was able to have her again. And in this particular situation, she would not have gone into a shelter if I wouldn't have addressed the main issue that she was concerned about, which was her cats. While she was in crisis because she was running out of gas money, she was living in her car. It's very hot in San Antonio. You know, also her car did not smell very well from the 6 cats in there. She was very stressed about all of those things, but she just didn't want to lose her cats. And so her immediate crisis was not her major depressive disorder. It was the situation with her cats. So we listened to her, addressed the situation, and we were able to help her. And she graduated from the program, and she has continued to be successful and is doing very well right now, and is offering peer support to others trying to recover from alcohol. The assessment in the situation, and we approached her, and we provided active listening, and we gave support, and we empathized with her, which is all very important strategies when you're working with someone that's in crisis. Another situation that I'm going to talk about is about a 52-year-old male. I was headed out with officers to go see some individuals in an encampment that we work at, and we stopped to talk to this individual on a corner as he was had a sign, and we were stopping to offer him services to see if we could assist him. And when we stopped to talk to him, he became very upset and was yelling, and within 5 to 10 minutes he was stating that he didn't want to live anymore, and we were by a major highway, and he started to walk towards the highway and said that he didn't want to live, and the officers were able to stop him. And during the incident, they were able to stop him from getting to the bridge, but then he buckled down and he was hitting his head on the ground, and they were able to stop him from hitting his head as well. And in this particular situation, I was able to walk over there and try to assist in calming him down, but at this point he was not at a point where he was really willing to communicate with anybody. So we waited for EMS to get there, and he was able to be taken to a hospital in emergency detention and get care. But I bring up this particular situation because I think in this situation, we discussed afterwards what we could have done differently, or, you know, I also discussed my feelings, and as that I have normally been in a hospital setting when those type of things either happen or people have injured themselves. And so, you know, the protocol for me as an outreach worker, when someone is bleeding and very angry and potentially could spit or injure me or continue to injure himself, what would be the protocol for myself in that particular situation? And at the time, I stood at a distance where I thought he wouldn't be able to spit on me because that was definitely something that could possibly happen. But later we discussed like being able to get masks for those type of situations, but also signals between myself and law enforcement, and when a situation is to a point where maybe I need to leave, or maybe talking to them more might be more helpful. And so in those types of situations, we always have to be prepared and assess and approach, and also be in constant communication with each other about what we should do. So my particular team is with SIPD and the Bexar County Sheriffs, and I go out with them. And so usually before we go, we're talking about what the situation is, we're talking about the environment, and then we're talking about what we do if there's a crisis. And I think based on that current situation, we've definitely talked more about, you know, our response in those type of situations. And so you always have to be prepared to address the crisis. And then the third crisis situation that I'm going to discuss that was very successful, and we were able to assist this gentleman is a 38-year-old veteran who was experiencing homelessness. We've been working with him for the last 10 months. And when we started working with him in June of 2019, he wanted nothing to do with our help. The officers had really great rapport with him. They'd known him for many years. And I was able to continue to go out there with officers so that I could build rapport with him. And over time, I was able to build the rapport with him. And he has a PTSD diagnosis. He also has a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. But more than that, he's been on the street for 8 years, and he has family that lives in San Antonio that stops and gives him food. And so he has a lot of feelings towards his family members and a lot of sadness about not being able to be in the military anymore. And so while I'm very aware of his diagnosis, I am also very empathetic to his situation and listening to his feelings about his anger towards his family and his sadness about panhandling and being out there when he used to serve our country, and now he's stated, I'm over here panhandling and asking people for money when I used to serve the country, and how embarrassing and how sad, and I don't want to be on drugs, but a lot of time I'm using drugs because I feel embarrassed. And so I have to look at all of those things, like his mental health diagnosis and then his feelings that he's telling me. So one day we were able to go and talk to him. It was under a bridge where he normally hangs out. And that particular day, he was very down. He wouldn't open his eyes. He said he didn't want to open his eyes because he just didn't want to be here anymore. He didn't say that he wanted to die. He said, I don't want to be here anymore. And so, you know, we talked to him about that. Well, what's going on? Why don't you want to be here anymore? What's happening? What's making you feel this way? And, you know, he discusses feelings about the panhandling and some of those other situations that cause him to feel like he's a nobody and that he's not important. So I was able to discuss with him the positive aspects and strengths that I see in him, that he is so helpful to the other homeless individuals that are around him. He's always finding food for them and trying to assist them and always worried about them. And then we discussed like his other strengths, that while he has had a really hard time for the last 7 or 8 years, that he's starting to work with us, that he's signing papers, that he's going to appointments, and that he's participating. And so, you know, as we continue to engage and talk with him, we're able to get him to agree to use a coping skill of walking around. And so we were able to get up, and we had to cross the street and walk in a safer location. And we walked around and talked. And, you know, we talked about coping skills like walking, because that's one thing that he can do. And so, and walking and talking with somebody. And so we walked and we talked, and then we were able to continue to work with him. And at that particular time, he wasn't at a point where the officers needed to do an emergency detention or anything like that, but we were able to help him in that particular crisis where he felt like he just didn't want to be here anymore. And while this individual, we continued to work with him, like I said, we've been working with him for 10 months, and he was housed and he was doing really well for quite some time. And he's had some road bumps, and he has chosen to go back out to homelessness, but has continued to work with us and try to work on his mental illness and his substance abuse, and is continuing to work with us. So while there are times where people see it as a failure, we see it as a success because he's continuing to communicate with us and talk with us. And we've only been working with him for 10 months. And so he's been out there for 7 or 8 years. And a lot of what Brian just talked about PTSD, not only the PTSD and the trauma that he experienced in the military, but also the PTSD and trauma that he's experienced in being on the street, it's a lot to work through. So we have to keep working with him through all of those things, and then continue to take baby steps with him through the process of getting to where he wants to be. He wants to be somewhere in his own apartment. He wants to help people, and he wants to be successful, and he's told us those things. So we're continuing to work with him, assess, actively listen, be non-judgmental. We give support, and we empathize. And the other things that we are always doing is strategizing when we go out to talk to anybody, especially if we know them. I try to get as much history from the officers that I work with. I also work with the hospital systems here and the court systems. And so what Brian was talking about is connections and coordination and engagement. It's very important to the work that we do. So we need to be connected to other members of the community, not just the members that are working with the homeless, but we also need to be connected to hospitals, court systems, to law enforcement, because there's so much vital information that can help us work with individuals to understand their whole picture. And then the other part that I always look for when I'm working with anybody that I'm working with is there a middle ground? Is there somewhere in the middle that we can be? If you don't want to go to a particular shelter, is there something else that you're willing to do? And thankfully here in San Antonio, we have the SIPD HOPE team, and they do ID recovery. And so sometimes that's the middle ground. That's the starting point for us. And so, you know, someone might not be willing to go to a shelter or go into a program. And so my first step with them is like, let me just help you get an ID, because regardless of what you're going to do, you're going to need an ID. If you want to get work, if you want to do anything, you're going to need an ID. So kind of finding that middle ground and what is something that you are willing to do. And sometimes it's talking with family. Sometimes people are willing to talk with their family. And to me, you might not be willing to go to a shelter. You might not be willing to go to a program, but we'll call your family member and we'll try to do a family session via phone in the middle of the woods, under a bridge, at a nearby establishment. And then we discuss action plans and we implement it. And then we develop action plans with the individuals that we're working with, and then we implement those action plans. And so oftentimes I'm having to coordinate with law enforcement to help transport, to get people to ID recovery, to get them to programs. And they implement the things that we need to do to get them to the program. So a lot of times I'll go ahead so that I can get in line, because oftentimes there's lines and the officers will pick them up and meet me there. So we develop action plans to try to help the individuals that we're working with. And then also the really, really important thing is when you're working with anybody, whether they have severe mental illness, substance abuse, or they're in crisis, is to be honest and empathetic. I'm always honest with the people that I work with that the system is hard. It's not going to be easy, but I'm going to be there and I'm going to walk through the system with you. I'm going to navigate the system with you. And sometimes the system, wherever we're going to go, it's a shelter or wherever, we're not going to be able to do what we thought we were going to do, but guess what? We're going to find a different option, and we're going to keep going. So if you keep working with me, I'm going to keep looking for the options to help you get to where you want to be. And so we just keep working with them, and we're honest with them. And another really great success recently that we had is with an individual who one of the officers informed me that he really wanted to be off the street because he had a child. He has major depression, and he has successfully got into the shelter. He's on medications. He had a job interview the other day, and he is doing very well. And so I was able to talk to him about all the systems that we're going to be working with, the mental health systems, the homeless systems, looking for the job, the systems, and prepare him for those systems. And so he told me yesterday that he was able to communicate with his doctor about his medication and that he felt it wasn't working because he was getting headaches and he wasn't sleeping well. And so because of that, the doctor was able to adjust his medication. And so I was really excited that he wasn't in crisis at that moment, but that's something that I talked to him about. Like, when you go to your doctor, when you go to these places, like, you need to tell them what's happening, and you need to tell them how you feel, what you think, and you need to advocate for yourself. If I'm unable to attend with you, you need to advocate for yourself. And so those are some examples of really good instances, and some, you know, like the middle instance where it was a learning experience for us, like what do I do and how do I do this? And so I think the best program that I found for individuals, whether you are a licensed clinical social worker, a clinician, an LPC, or a case manager, is the Mental Health First Aid. They have a website. You can get on there and you can provide training. And then the other thing is that just be empathetic and listen, and don't judge someone off their diagnosis, and be willing to really be a strengths perspective, use a strengths perspective and look for what they're asking for, and try to help them so that you can have that connection with them and you can help walk them through the system. And I think that is it for my part. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tiffany. Wonderful. Both presentations were just terrific, so thank you both. I am going to start us off with a question that we got during your presentation, Brian. And I am wondering if you, actually, Nancy Burke-Bradley is wondering, can you give us some information about dealing with a client who may have narcissistic personality disorder?
Absolutely. And Nancy, thank you so much for that question. It is a difficult, and I don't have to say this too many times, they can be very difficult individuals to work with, in part because they feel that there's nothing to work on. So when we're looking at how to engage with those individuals, which I'm assuming is the question here, there are a couple of ways. And if we could connect, I could give you a link to a wonderful site through the Mayo Clinic as far as how they're handling it. They do it in a biphasic way. They work directly with the individual and they provide them with information, for instance, of different things that they can do. Like, for instance, keep an open mind. And if you're given a treatment plan, try to stick with it. If there's alcohol or other things involved, please make sure that you follow through, but stay focused on your goals. What they also do is give the person some things that they can bring to their appointment, questions that they would want to ask. Like, you know, what are my symptoms? Get some personal information. How long do you think this condition is? What types of strategies do you have to try to help me out? And then for the mental health provider who is having the great difficulty of doing this connection, what types of things to engage that person. Now, everything that Tiffany had said a little earlier, I think is very germane to how you would connect with these folks, because what you're doing is you're trying to get them to engage. How do you get them to connect? And one of the ways to get them to connect is to not invalidate their narcissism. Because quite often they will say to you, I know what's going on with me, I know what's whatever, and quite often our responses to that can simply be, tell me in your words what is going on. Help us to understand it a little bit better, but keep the team approach and the engagement as your primary focus. I don't know, Tiffany, if you have anything else to add to that? Or?
I don't think so. Okay, thanks. So, Tiffany, I'm going to start with you with this question. I know it's one that you probably won't be surprised by, because I think I asked you this question when we were preparing for the webinar. But Annette Robertson is asking, since some people lack trust in law enforcement, do they wear their uniforms, or are they dressed in more appropriate attire, such as T-shirts? But what I know that this can be a problem. So how do you navigate that lack of trust with the officers? So I think that in my particular role, I work with SAPD officers who are in uniform. While we do have SAPD officers, the mental health team, who are not in traditional uniform, the officers that I work with are in uniform. And I think that here in San Antonio, in my role, I haven't had difficulty with people being unwilling or not wanting to engage with the officers that I work with. A lot of the officers already know the individuals because they run into them on a daily basis, and they know them very well. So they already have established rapport, which is great for me when I come in. But then the other thing that I think has been helpful is that we're constantly learning from each other. And so I've done trainings on motivational interviewing to the officers that I work with, and then they have also been able to provide me with trainings as well on maybe how they communicate, what policies they have, and we kind of find ways to be prepared when we go into encampments or we go to talk to particular individuals and how we will engage with them. And so there was a presentation that we did in the community, and one of the officers said that he listens to me before we go somewhere and kind of figure out how we're going to communicate, but really it's a team effort. Like, so we discuss what's going to be present there, and then we discuss like what we know about the individuals, and then we figure out what is our strategy for communication that day. And so I would say that it would be really important to engage the law enforcement and start teaching each other, and then ensuring that you communicate before you go to whatever site you're going to. Like, what are we looking to accomplish today, and how can we accomplish that together? And then starting to do trainings together, and I think that has been helpful. And additionally, I think it's important to remember that a lot of the individuals who are experiencing homelessness, or at least here in San Antonio, they run into law enforcement on a daily basis. And so they may or may not like running into them, but they're used to it. Whereas I might not be. I get pulled over and I get really nervous because I'm going to be getting a ticket, and I don't necessarily run into law enforcement on a daily basis. And so while I do understand some people have bad experiences, but at the same time, I do think that a lot of our officers run into individuals experiencing homelessness on a regular basis. And so I think starting to help them go out there and letting them know, hey, Officer so-and-so is working with me. We're working together to help you. We're not trying to cause harm. We're here to help you. And so that's been helpful for us.
Thank you. Brian, anything to add? I don't know what you've seen in terms of working with outreach workers, working with police officers or law enforcement officers, sheriff's departments, or other.
Well, not a huge amount to add to it, but I did want to support something that Tiffany had said a little earlier about working with the officers, because what we found very successful with these officers, the example that I gave about the officers that engaged, the case example that I had given a little earlier about Nicholas, they were fully uniformed officers. But part of it was they had engagement skills. What they did was they talked to him in a language that was very soothing, very comforting. They walked up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir. My name is Officer Johnson. This is Officer Smith. How can we assist you?" Instead of "What's wrong with you?" or "We're here to get you." Because there's also that community piece that we need to take a look at, the community traumatic experiences where police officers are viewed in that fashion, that if one is coming in your neighborhood, it's an automatic aversion. They are coming because you did something wrong and you're going to get arrested. On the other hand, and I saw this in one of the questions that was a little earlier, they were mentioning about the hot team. I wanted to also mention that on the other side of that coin, the hot team members were these group of police officers that on their time off, actually with the city, at city expense, they were given a vehicle that was labeled hot team, and they were given T-shirts. So they didn't wear their uniforms in the evening time. And when they were in the homeless communities, they were able to then engage, with them And everyone there knew they were officers, but it didn't seem to make much difference. So I can see it both ways. Hello?
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 Oh, I am sorry. I have been talking away. Thank you so much. I apologize. Oh, I had just gotten through this whole question, but I'll shorten it now. So Brian, a couple people have been talking a little bit about hoarding, which is definitely a behavior that we see and one that can make it difficult to stay housed once you've become housed. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that or not. It's an interesting topic.
It's a very interesting topic, and it's one where I think most of them are aware that hoarding isn't something that you can say to an individual that will alter the behavior. It's much more in-depth, but it is still, I want to keep it on the simple basis, it's still about establishing the connection and establishing the trust, because nothing else is going to happen unless it is there. The person who is hoarding because of many factors that we may not be aware of, but they don't trust you to open up to that. And they're using the hoarding as their protective measure. So getting in would mean that you first don't talk about the hoarding, but you simply engage with that person to get them more comfortable. Now, I realize in certain settings it's difficult to have that length of time to be able to do it, but the most success that has been seen with hoarding has really been with people that have the underlying conditions exposed, that this person may have experienced neglect or rejection in their earlier years, and the hoarding is an off element of that, to where they're now hoarding because they never had anything to begin with. So once we understand that and the trust is established, then things can begin to change.
Thank you. Absolutely. Tiffany, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. All right. So I am going to we've got 2 minutes left, and we need a tiny bit of time at the end for Zach. But what I would like to ask each of you is if you could determine the one thing that people will walk away from today from your presentation, what would that be? What would you want people to walk away from this with?
Tiffany can go first if you wish.
Yes, I'll go first. I think the one thing that I would want everybody to walk away with is that you continue to advocate, stay determined, be empathetic, and show trust, build trust with the people that you're working with, and listen. I think it's really, really important to actively listen to what the person is telling you and try to meet them in the middle and find a way to work with them and do it in, it can be those, I often say those baby steps. Like, we're just taking baby steps. Let's take those baby steps and then continue to offer praise and continue to let them know that you're there and that you're going to continue to help them as they take all these steps. So I think that's a really important aspect.
And Tiffany, my response to that, I'm sorry, my response to that is very brief. It is a resounding ditto to everything that you just said. I can't imagine any other measure of really getting involved with the people that we serve than to better understand what it takes to link up with that person. When they feel they are being cared for, you have got a partner in the treatment strategy as opposed to a person that's waiting for directions from you.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you both. And now we really are out of time. If you download the slide deck from the Download Materials Here pod, you will have access to Tiffany and Brian's email addresses and references that you can look